Welcome to the Cultivate Church Planting Podcast. We believe that the gospel is the hope of the world and that the world needs more gospel-centered churches. Okay, welcome to the Cultivate Church Planting Podcast, and I'm really excited about today's episode because we're going to be talking about, of course, church planting. We're always talking about church planting, evangelism, mission work, which is our heart. But I've got some friends here that are involved in the virtual reality, the metaverse world, and some of the great things that God is doing in that space. And so I'm really happy to have you guys. And I've got Stuart McPherson here. And Stuart's the VR campus pastor at Lakeland Community Church in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Did I get that right?
Yeah, you got it 100%.
All right, I did a little research ahead of time about. Actually, I did a lot. The church it looks amazing, and was able to run through the website, and very, very similar to actually our church here, just in the doctrinal statement and all that. So refreshing to see. But he's also the host of the Metaverse Church podcast, which I'll put the link to that show in the show notes here. So, yay! And I was able to check out a few episodes. We were talking before we started recording here. That really interesting stuff. And for our listeners, something that you may not know about me is since a young, early age, which was a long time ago, I've been into video games, and my dad. I remember when my dad brought home a Commodore 64 computer, and I played King's Quest on it. And this whole space, I've seen, and maybe you could talk to some of this too, Stuart. But I've seen it develop over the years, where it's gone from just like side scroller video games, where you're push A, B, up, down, that sort of thing, into what has become like a community of gamers. Esports, of course, is massive, huge industry. And then not only that, but communities now are forming within these games. So you have the massive multiplayer online games. And so you have these different little pockets of communities. I wouldn't even say little, massive communities where people are building relationships and, talking about life and politics and you name it. So I am pretty familiar with that side of things, but then when it comes to virtual reality, we get into a whole new realm of immersive, kind of interactive, community-based things. So I'm getting ahead of myself, but I'm just kind of I'm setting this up. But why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, Stuart, and what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, you hit it 100%. I'm the VR campus pastor over at Lakeland Community Church. The funny part is, as you're explaining your background and your fandom for video games and everything, the truth is that is not my story, nor is that my background whatsoever. I'm pretty sure the first video game that I ever played was probably Super Mario on the Super Nintendo. My sister had that console. I ended up getting the Sega Genesis. So I was all about like Mortal Kombat during those days, like back, yay, Scorpion, uppercut, finish him, all that kind of good stuff. But yeah, I'm pretty sure the last console that I ever had was the Xbox 360. And I primarily bought that just to be able to play Blu-ray at the time, which for your younger listeners, it's a disc that played movies on it, because we don't do that anymore.
No, man.
And you said esports, so I was playing NCAA football, and I was playing Madden on it, but that was pretty much the last of my video game immersiveness. So my passion and my background does not include really video games whatsoever. So imagine my surprise when all of a sudden I'm moving into the seat as a VR campus pastor, which there's a little bit of that where I asked for it and didn't ask for it all at the same time. So my family and we moved out here to Wisconsin just almost 2.5 years ago at this point, I guess. And we came out here for me to be the small groups pastor at Lakeland. And we did it smack dab in the middle of COVID. So my first interview with Lakeland was the same week that everything went to lockdown.
Wow.
And so I was like, man, so this probably isn't going to go anywhere. I totally understand that. No hard feelings. And, they told me, hey, we're probably going to take this process a little slow now because everything. I was like, totally get it. Well, Lakeland's version of slow is I heard like within 48 hours that they were scheduling a next interview with me for 2 weeks later. And then again, it was like, hey, we're going to take this slow. 48 hours, let's schedule the next one. And that was pretty much the rhythm and routine of it until next thing I know, June of 2020, we're accepting an offer to move out here. July of 2020, we moved from Colorado Springs, where I was doing young adult ministry out there, to now moving into the small group position. And I came into a church staff where the senior pastor and executive pastor were already talking about, what would it look like for us to get into virtual reality and do ministry in there. And I was like, all power to you guys. That's not my
You
thing,
had no desire. So that was in the middle of COVID. Like that's when they're at home. They're not coming to the church building.
Right.
Yeah.
But the interest for Lakeland to get into VR ministry was happening well before COVID even happened. So they were already moving in that direction before anybody was thinking of it. In fact, Lakeland was moving that direction. There was an article that came out, and I don't remember which magazine it was, but it was on DJ Soto and VR Church. And this is while I was still in Colorado Springs. And the staff and I, at the church I was working at then at the time, we were talking about how dumb the idea of virtual reality church is. Was not about it whatsoever. And I was probably one of the loudest voices in the room. I was like, so again, pre-COVID, right?
Yeah.
So I was like, VR church is the dumbest thing I ever heard of before. And I was against even digital ministry at the time. I was like the
even
digital
Zoom,
side would,
all that stuff. Yeah.
Yep, totally against.
Okay.
I was like, that can never be a true expression of the church. That was like February 2020.
Okay.
A month later, how things change quickly and rapidly, because I'm now sitting in the seat as that young adult pastor, having to figure out how do I keep my young adults in community when they're stuck at home. So I'm quickly creating a YouTube channel. We're launching a podcast, all that kind of stuff, doing Zoom meetups, everything in order to stay in community with my young adults there. So all of a sudden I was like, dude, digital totally has a place. The church has a place in digital, and digital has a place in the church.
Yeah, we all did.
100%. But I was still meh on VR. So you fast forward about a year. So we're now in 2021, and our senior pastor came to me and our next gen director and said, hey, we want to try this idea of virtual reality church. Ultimately, the idea was our next gen director knows the gaming background. He's got all that. If we get Stuart in there and we're able to get at least a small group going out of it, we would consider it a win. So I'm bringing in the small group DNA. He's bringing in the gaming experience and all that. And that's how we launched. March 28th was our soft launch of 2021 with an official launch for Easter Sunday. And we haven't really looked back since. And at that time, I moved into the digital pastor seat. So now it made sense, VR, digital. And then less than a year later, I sat there and went to my senior leadership as we were talking about VR. And I said, look, you guys, if somebody's in a crisis moment in Lake Geneva, all they have to do is drive down the street, and we sit on a beautiful corner between two highways. You just have to drive down the street and they can see a physical building and say, hey, maybe, just maybe, in the middle of my crisis, those guys have an answer for me that I can go talk to. But we were doing ministry in VR where we were showing up once on a Sunday morning, doing our service, and then we were gone the rest of the week. And so I presented the idea of like, we need to be more of a presence, and we need to be a church in VR that we can basically replicate what does it look like to be a church on the street corner in virtual reality. And what that turned into was me going full time, being the VR campus pastor for Lakeland, building out a launch team like you would for church planning for the sake of being able to have a presence in VR. at least 5 days a week. That way people start associating church and VR with Lakeland.
That's
so
so
that's
interesting.
pretty much how I got there.
Man, I never would have thought, like, doing a church planting podcast, the planting of a church or a ministry within virtual reality. All right, our VR friend, what do you what do you have to say about it? Because we were just together, so we went into we had our VR headsets on. I got the tour. I saw the Lakeland campus. And it's all for our listeners out there. You're trying to visualize this. It's pretty immersive. So if you've ever done VR before, a lot of people have, but you walk into these places, and so tell me a little bit about your experience. What you've been doing?
So my experience was when I had a Oculus Rift headset back when it was called Oculus in 2019. Went to the VR at church at the time because they didn't rebrand to VR MMO church yet. And then what ends up happening is COVID hits, and I sit down with the local church that had like 60 some people, and with my some of the elders there, and was like, hey, like Zoom isn't really gonna work for fellowship. Discord won't even work for fellowship. So what about this experience where people could walk up and talk to someone naturally, for the 90-year-olds in this community who don't know how to join a Discord channel? And so that was a huge moment, but the leadership was like, we can't have main service become that. We'll still do a YouTube live stream. And then my father was financially supportive enough to help us get headsets for some of the prayer team. So then we started meeting every weekly on Tuesdays.
So this was during the like you guys
the
were
very beginning.
You guys were like locked in your homes,
in,
kind of thing.
Yeah.
I say that because we lived in New Zealand during that original part, and we were literally locked down in our homes. So, but you had a little bit more freedom here, especially down here in Florida where we are. But anyway,
they had
another story.
It was March 16th that they had like the mandate that you weren't supposed to leave your home in the state.
So you guys had you got the VR headsets.
Yeah.
You had your dad was able to
and we
buy
got
some
prayer
for
team Tuesdays and Thursdays. That turned into an evangelistic opportunity because we'd go world hopping afterwards. People would want prayer.
What's world hopping? You're using big terms here.
So world hopping is on the social VR platforms. A lot of people have uploaded their own worlds, their own 3D models you can explore and interact with. And so what ends up happening is a lot of people, when they're hanging out and talking, like going to a different world to talk in. I want to go to an aquatic world and hang out with fish. I want to go to, I want to go to a Star Wars
Jesus
world
fish.
because there's no copyright issues at the moment in virtual reality. So it's a lot of fun times.
So you basically showed me one of the worlds you created. It looks like a church building. You walk in the door.
And that's where I met for prayer meetings.
And so you met in this little gathering room for prayer with the other
and then
people that were part of that group.
After evangelizing.
And then you'd hang out.
Yep. Evangelizing, hanging out and stuff. We got to pray for a lot of people. Eventually, I got noticed that I had built a church campus by Cornerstone and helped build their campus.
Okay.
And that really opened up a lot of questions of like, okay, can we build the Stations of the Cross? Which is so that people can think about like what Jesus went through going to the cross.
Cool.
Then eventually I got invited to the welcome team of VR MMO Church, and then did that for a bit, and then got moved to the announcements team.
So
and
Stuart, talk about a church service.
Me.
You're the campus pastor. I put on my headset. I go into wherever the world is. What was it called?
The Lakeland VR campus?
Yeah, that's in, what's the social?
AltSpace VR.
AltSpace VR, okay. So there's different social VR networks. So I put this thing on, I'm going into that world that you guys have created, which is awesome, by the way. It's really cool. Like you can look over it. He showed me that there's like a nature, like a waterfall that you can, and then walk us through what happens during a church service. Like, are you in there talking, or is the service streamed from do I call it the real world into the virtual world?
I call it the physical world, but
physical,
this all
okay,
works.
yeah, that's how. What's a normal a person who just comes in and goes to a service? What's that look like?
Yeah, so for us at Lakeland, we stream our services in from our main campus. So for anybody listening that is used to like video venue multi-site, that's pretty much what our VR campus is. We're video venue multi-site, and then I'm there for the soul care, helping people take next steps and all that kind of good stuff. So, which wasn't always the case, but we can talk about that later if you want.
Okay.
But so when you come in, you spawn in at the entrance, the outdoor entrance to our building, and we strategically, Pastor Goose, who's my co-host with the Metaverse Church podcast, he's actually the one who built the world for us, and the idea and the heartbeat behind even what was built was we wanted to take elements of what you would recognize in real life with Lakeland. So the idea was if anybody from our VR campus ever came to Lake Geneva, they would already in some way feel familiar with the building, because we said, this is what we look like. Here are the elements that we would like to see. Everything else, it's VR. So get creative. So as you guys saw, when you show up, you've got our building that looks somewhat like our building in real life. We have a video screen right out front, so you don't ever really have to enter into the building if you don't want to. But once you enter in, there's some great advertisement, shows what my picture as in the avatar form to say, hey, if you want to connect with the pastor, which is me, here's how you do it. If you want to partner with us financially, you can do that. And then, of course, join our Discord. You walk past that wall and you walk right into the auditorium, which is a big, massive screen for to be able to watch a service. Outside of that auditorium, there's another hallway that leads you to the backside, which then leads you to downtown Lake Geneva. I don't know what, like, so Lake Geneva is not massive in any sense of the word, but we have a city with skyscrapers and all that kind of stuff, and really that was, hey, let's just let's create an area where we can do small groups, you know, in the same way that we ask for small groups to get out into the community. Let's be out in the community. So we've got a gym, we've got a bar, we've got a coffee shop, we've got a movie theater, we got a central park. And so that's where when we do events throughout the week, more small group based, we do it in that area. Nice. And then my senior pastor asked that one of those areas, in addition to the environment, would be our waterfall scene. And the idea was if we do a worship night, or if we were just wanting to play like worship music in general for people to come in and see, there was a spot that was just really designed for being out there, get into the environment, be in the presence of the Lord, and worship within that environment.
And you've got that big screen out there too, for lack of a better word. It's got that huge, massive screen that kind of is within this whole naturescape scene.
Yep.
That beams the physical world, I use your word, into that virtual reality space that you've created.
Yeah, and the heartbeat behind that even was each of those screens that we have anywhere in the world, they project and you can hear clearly the message or the music that's going on. So you don't have to be in the auditorium of our VR world in order to get the message in. You can, as our VR friend was saying earlier, people world hop. They love to be in those spaces in order to go explore. So we were like, okay, let's give the church feel. Let's give creative element to it. Let's allow people to do what it is that they naturally do in these environments, all while still being able to hear the message that's going on and play to all of those strengths. So that's what people see currently when you hop into AltSpace VR and you check out Lakeland VR.
So when I was doing a little research on this, ever since we got together and we were talking about this, you know, this isn't just like some listeners are listening in right now and they're thinking, yeah, that's kind of a niche, like small thing. I actually read in 2022, 171 million people are in virtual reality. That's a lot of people.
Yep. Yeah.
So for us to look at this and say, that's not really a thing, and we kind of make fun of it like you did at the beginning, like that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard. It's funny. I was talking to my wife.
Hey,
go ahead.
Crow tastes good, just so you know.
Yeah, you've seen the difference. Yeah, that's why I'm glad you're on the show today. But I was driving up here to the church right now, and my wife was in the car. She's like, "What are you doing today?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm meeting this guy, and he does ministry in virtual reality and church planning and all that kind of stuff. He's a campus pastor." And she's like, "That sounds silly." So I'm gonna make sure to get her a pre-release copy of this episode so she can listen. Better yet, I'm gonna put the headset on her and be like, "Here you go." So this is a big area. I mean, and it's only growing. Like the technology is advancing rapidly. Like people are saying, this is, COVID kind of really started the real like focus on it. Not only with Zoom meetings. Like before, you made a good point. We would never have thought, yeah, let's all get together on Skype or on Zoom, and that's a real thing. But I was just in a prayer meeting 2 days ago with people from all over Central and South America praying for churches over there. There was probably 30 or 40 people. And it was a real, like people say, is that real? That was a real prayer meeting. We really prayed for people. And it's not, I can ramble on and on, but like, what do you see as going into the future that this space is gonna be? Especially for us as church planters and as Christians to get involved in.
Yeah, so we got a guy at the church that has a huge evangelistic heart. I hate giving ages to people because usually I'm wrong and I go like way higher than what they actually are, and I'm super offensive in that way. But I would say that he's probably mid-60s, 70s. And like I said, huge evangelistic heart. So when we first got into this, he ends up coming up to me and he says, "Hey, sir, you've been doing this VR thing for a little bit now. Like, what do you love most about it?" And I don't know that at the time when he asked that question, I had put much thought to what it was that I was enjoying about this. But I told him, I was like, at the end of the day, I think what I enjoy most about this is I became an international missionary without ever having to leave my basement. Mm-hmm. And the reason why was because we had people coming from Spain, we had people coming from the Middle East, we had people coming from UK, Canada, Mexico, who are all hopping in on our services that in real life, I probably would have never met these people or had the chance to present the gospel to them. And so all of a sudden, I'm seeing this opportunity to be a hope dealer to people, planting seeds of hope all over the world with maybe, just maybe, the idea that they'll take what it is that they've heard back into their families, back into their businesses, back into areas that are not accepting of the gospel or the Bible or the name of Jesus. And within their small little pocket, their community, all of a sudden revival just breaks through. Mm-hmm. But to your point, 171 million people around the world are diving into virtual reality. I saw another report that said 23 million businesses are projected to hop into it here in 2023. Wow. And so when you think about that, 23 million businesses, that means that 171 is going to grow exponentially.
Oh yeah, they're going to be pushing it. If they're investing in it, they're going to be pushing it.
Yep, absolutely. And I had the opportunity to talk this one out with my senior pastor, and I loved his insight on it. He said, when cell phones came out, most people didn't invest into a cell phone because, one, they either didn't see the need, or two, they didn't have the finances for it. But then all of a sudden, companies started buying cell phone plans for the employees. And along with that, so let's say you fast forward now, all of a sudden people have these iPhones that they got from their business in order to do their work that now have the apps on there, like whether that's Pokemon Go or Facebook or whatever. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden you have more investment and involvement in these platforms, app-wise and cell phone-wise, because businesses were the ones who primarily bought into it. So now all of a sudden you have businesses that are going to be primarily buying into virtual reality, and all of a sudden you're going to start seeing these businesses, possibly, this is all just assumption, but I feel like it's a safe assumption, they're going to be giving these headsets to employees that are all of a sudden going to find themselves hopping into social VR platforms like big screen and VR chat and whatnot. And realistically, what I expect to see happen is a lot of these businesses will look for what does it look like to bring advertisement into marketing into those platforms as well. So when you talk about what is the future for this, man, if Jesus is all about, if his mission is all about reaching the lost, well, I've painted the picture like this before. We have entered into a time space where the movement of God started in this small little area called Jerusalem, and then post-resurrection and post-Pentecost just blows up and starts going out into the rest of the world, because that's what we were called to do as followers of Jesus. But now, all of a sudden, what went out wide is starting to come back inward, because we're all centrally located in one spot in digital metaverse that is now then pouring back out into the rest of the world. So that's cool.
That's crazy. All right, VR friend, VR Chap. I'm going to call you VR Chap.
Sounds Chap.
We were instead of VR Chat, that's it. Anyway.
Exactly.
Okay, we were talking before some of the, because you brought up a good point about the phones. Like, man, I remember when I got a BlackBerry, it's like, I thought I was the businessman of the year, you know, it's like, or church guy of the year. You got the BlackBerry with the keyboard on it. But at the same time, you see some of the negatives that come in. Cell phone is a good example, you know, with social media and stuff, and some of the way that it's turned out to be a great thing in many ways, some drawbacks. We were talking before about when we were going into these church worlds. There, on one of them, there was a sign at the beginning before you get in, you know, to adjust your settings. And you were trying to explain this. Maybe you could explain this to our listeners, because there are people that come in and try to wreak havoc and disrupt, and the whole trolling thing, bullying, that whole vibe that's in other places. Why don't you talk a little bit about that and what some of the things that people are doing?
Yeah, VR chat is one of the platforms that churches try to have platforms on and campuses. And what will happen is, because every user can upload their own avatar, they can upload avatars that have malicious scripts.
What's an avatar? Explain what an avatar.
You know,
like a character.
A character, like a human body typically, but it could be a cat body. It could be any sort of. Some people come in as helicopters, like it's hilarious. But you know, it's a whole new world where
just don't sit in front of me in the church service if you're a helicopter.
Exactly, the blades get really distracting, and what ends up happening is people will then switch into an avatar that causes everyone to crash that doesn't have their safety settings on. And then the safety setting could be, if I don't know you, don't show me the avatar. Okay. And so that's how.
And there's also there's a lot of other reasons why you wouldn't want to see many of the avatars if you don't know the person. Or because there's a lot of I think someone described it as like a dark underbelly of this whole VR world. And like Stuart, that's one of the criticisms I'm sure that you've heard is like, you know, we don't want to go in there because it's a bad place. There's bad people there. They're doing immoral, sexual. There's a lot of sexual stuff going on. Like, what would you say to someone who has that criticism, in many ways valid, to encourage them, like, hey, we need to get in there?
Don't walk out your front door.
in the real world?
In the real world, because that's what's going on in the real world.
Yeah, believe me. Yeah, that's
try to escape your own thoughts. Because, you know, like really take advantage of what the Bible says and capture your thoughts. Yeah. You know, it's crazy because like it is true. You can look. I mean, this is a church-based podcast, so it's easy for me to sit here and say, like, there's this real thing called sin, and there's this, our human nature is to be sinful, and with the Holy Spirit in us, there's this tension that is like, oh man, I really want to chase after that because that looks amazing and tempting, and I bet you I'd have a lot of fun with it. And then there's the spirit side that's like slapping us upside the backside of the head, going, no, dummy, don't do that. But in those spaces, like because of the I stumble over this word, but because of the anonymity that is associated with it, like it is so easy for anybody to really act out on those impulses of
Right,
like,
and not get
man, I would do
consequences.
this.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I would do this if my face wasn't attached to it, the church I'm associated with wasn't attached to it, my family wasn't attached to it. Like if I could do this and never get caught, I would do this. And these platforms, they provide that opportunity to do it. But you know, if you're talking about like from the perspective of why should a church get into an area like that, again, I would say don't walk out your front door. Like if you don't want to experience any of that, man, those are the people who are coming into your brick and mortar church. But
Yeah,
really,
exactly.
like the reason why you would want to go into a place like VR Chat, which is the wild, wild west of VR platforms, is because you're trying to reach the lost. Like I say on my Discord, my tag on there is I'm attacking the gates of hell and advancing God's kingdom through a headset. Like that's what you
like
should
that.
be
That's cool.
doing as a follower of Jesus, is just like, dude, let's go plunder hell, populate heaven through a headset, and let's go into the places where people are that don't know anything about Jesus, or they do, and they want to find their escape, you know, and find those people and go, hey, even here it still counts. Like we're
Yeah,
not
that's a
talking
good
about
point,
earthly
'cause
bodies,
you're not
we're
just
talking about
seeing-
soul bodies.
Exactly. You're not just seeing unbelievers in there. You're seeing Christians in there that you can, keep accountable and like, hey, we're Christians here. Just, it's a lot of it's a good point, and I'm just thinking through all this as you're talking, but the real battle happens in the mind. It doesn't, it is, with our physical bodies, but the battle itself and the temptations in that are in the mind, and through this sort of thing, you got to be Christians everywhere. So that's a good point. What are some of the coolest things, that you've seen? You've already shared some great stuff just about people getting connected and no, here, let me ask this first, because I've been wanting to ask this. So you kept talking about your senior pastor. So I myself am a senior pastor here. Like he's got 100% buy-in into this. Does he like visit the campus and like come into the worlds at all, or is he just like a believer in it?
He's been there a couple times. I've seen him pop in here and there whenever he's not teaching. I think that it's just harder for him to be in because he is our primary teacher, right? But he was there to commission the team when we launched. He announces it every single week from stage. So every single morning or every single Sunday when he pops up on stage for both services, it's hey, we want to welcome everybody in the room, online, and in VR. So
Wow.
like,
So he's bought in. He's
giving,
in.
without like, yeah, he's not sitting there going, hey, just so everybody knows, we have a VR campus, and he's like trying to bring any kind of awareness to it. The way that he talks about it is, this is a natural thing. This is who Lakeland is, and this is where our Lakeland people are. They're in person, they're online, and they're in VR.
Wow.
So yeah, 100% bought in.
Here's another question. Is there space, because this is a church planting podcast, yours is a campus, a satellite campus of the main church. You're showing the video. I've got kind of two questions. First is, do you know of any churches that are only in the virtual reality world, VR world, in the metaverse? And like, what would you say is the difference between having the connection? Because what I love is, they actually have a connection with you guys. You said, let's make this building to look like our building where we are, and the city to look like the city where we are. What about like people that are going in and just creating ministries and churches that are disconnected from any like real world stuff?
Yeah, so I can think of two off the top of my head. Our VR Chap. I feel like I have to emphasize that key. Or VR Chap could probably give more insight on the ones that he knows of. But I can think of two off the top of my head. VR MMO Church, and then Oasis Church VR or Oasis VR, Oasis Church VR, right? I'm pretty sure is what
VR
I,
chat.
I
Why don't
always
you weigh in on
called it.
this?
I always call it Oasis Church, but yeah, VR. So since I go to VR MMO Church and go to Cornerstone, which has a hybrid metaverse church that has a physical campus, the differences I see a lot is the decisions are ultimately made a lot of the times by staff that are sometimes not very present in the metaverse, whereas when the church is entirely digital, they might have their meeting in a different platform like spatial.io or whatnot, but it's still everyone that's making the decisions are all know what is involved when it comes to ministering to VR people. It also, just so that encourages a lot newer ideas, newer approaches. But I think that's just the biggest difference is everyone's informed.
Do you think there's space for churches like, let's say ours? We're a pretty new church plant, but within our ministry, do you think there's still space for churches to get involved in the metaverse and start some kind of a ministry? And how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, so what's interesting is even as I moved into this position that I was in, it was really hard. So everything for the church world hopping into metaverse ministry, specifically VR, blew up once Live Church hopped in November 2021. Yeah, 2021.
You're talking about Life Church with Groeschel, with Craig Groeschel.
Right, Craig Groeschel.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So they hopped in, and within a week or two of Life Church hopping in, all of a sudden, my phone and email started blowing up from people who are just like, hey, we just want to know what your guys' experience is. What would it look like for us to get into it? And at one point in time, I started telling a lot of these church leaders, I'm like, here's the hard part. I can easily advocate for two things. One, every church needs to have an expression in virtual reality metaverse. And look, we talked about this before we started recording. If you ask me to explain metaverse, that's super hard. but I would say just know that VR is just an arm to the galaxy that is virtual reality. And probably a small arm at that right now. But I would tell them, it's like every church should have an expression of virtual reality as a part of what they're doing, even if it's just what we originally set out to do, even if it's just a small group. If you just launch a small group in there.
Yeah, and often we talk about church planning, that's often the start of a church is just a small group meeting in a living room, and gathering together and reading the word and worshiping, praying a little bit, with a... so yeah, you can just kind of transfer it over to that application.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and there's even some people that I talked to today at Lakeland that when I'm trying to onboard new team members, I think the biggest hurdle to get over is just that idea that it's virtual reality, right? But if you can put the spin on it and I've talked to a few people about this, I'm like, don't see it as you're trying to get into virtual reality and bring Jesus there. I said, think of it as this is a bridge to connect you to those that are lost, that you already have the heartbeat for. This is what you were wired for, was to speak to lost people and introduce them to Jesus, and they're all pocketed right here. All you have to do in order to reach them is put a headset on. That's it. Past that, it's exactly the same. It really is. So I advocate every church should have an expression in there, even if it's just a small group. And what got weird for me was I was advocating that I think that every church should have a metaverse VR pastor, probably full time. And what was hard for me to say that at the time was I wasn't even full time. I was splitting my responsibilities between everything else digitally that we were doing with virtual reality. But I mean, in a given week, I'm probably in the headset, just the headset alone, 10, 12 hours a week.
Yeah.
But that's not including our VR chat is like, oh, that's this is a small amount compared to what I am, but
Yeah, I mean, I looked at my Steam profile and I have 80 hours in VR chat for over the last 2 weeks, so 40 hours a week.
Full-time job.
But
Yeah.
no, but for real, like I think like what's hard for me, like I think that's a real thing though. But I think what's hard for me is like there's the team building aspect, like talking to my team. There is the part of it is launching new small groups or whatever else is going on. There's the weekly responsibilities. So I think that I would love to be in it more, and I'm kind of forced to be in it more. I say 10 to 12, and that was probably before the announcement of AltSpace VR shutting down, because that's actually forced me to have to be more explorative of the other options that are out there lately. But there is enough to do ministry-wise that I was telling people, I was like, dude, I could easily advocate for this being a full-time position, even though I, at the time, was not full-time. But now being full-time, backed 100% by a church to do this, easily I can stay busy enough
Just doing that.
with the opportunities of reaching people. So
I love it, man. And we're going to wrap things up now. But, I think what comes to my mind is like, don't knock it till you try it. I'm going to get my wife into one of these headsets, and it's different. Like, let's be honest, it's weird. Even it's not the normal. You see a helicopter or a cat person running around. It's going to take some getting used to, but at the same time, like you said, that's where the people are. That's where the lost are. And we have a responsibility and an opportunity, I would even say, to meet this space with Jesus Christ. And with a planting type ministry, most of the time I think extension out of your own church or, even a small Bible study. But yeah, man, I'd love to keep talking. I could talk about this forever. I'd appreciate it if you get on another episode maybe in the future. But you got any last words, Stuart, for our listeners?
yeah, I'll just say this, 2 quick things. Again, 171 million people in virtual reality. I grew up in a church plant. That was pretty much my first existence with church. And where I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, 90% lost. For that city, 500,000, 600,000 people, 90% lost.
Bro, do you know where Ruidoso is?
I do.
That's where I grew up.
Yeah, I grew up in Albuquerque.
All right,
that's my home
Yeah,
state.
I grew up at Ruidoso's about 3 hours south in New Mexico. That's where I grew up.
Wow.
So,
Yeah.
New Mexico, that's a weird place.
yeah.
You think virtual reality is weird?
really
Try
is.
New Mexico. No, go ahead.
For real.
No offense to
For
New
real.
Mexicans.
But if it's worth starting a church in a city that has 600,000 people and 90% of it is lost, I bet you that percentage of lost people of 171 million is a lot higher. I bet you it's probably 98, 99% lost. I'd be willing to go that far.
Yeah.
And so if there's a reason to get to church plant in Albuquerque, New Mexico for 90%, I guarantee you there's a reason to church plant for 98, 99%. But then the other thing that I would say real quick is, like, we've mentioned AltSpace VR a couple of times, and not sure when this episode is debuting, but AltSpace is shutting down as of March 10th, and that's really where a lot of churches are right now. And I just see like the heartbeat of God and God's fingerprint all over the idea of this shutdown, because again, after the resurrection, what we see is the small group of Jesus followers huddled together behind locked doors in fear that maybe even the religious leaders and the Romans were going to come after them. And they were commissioned to go into the world and make disciples. So then all of a sudden you have Pentecost happens, the Spirit comes upon them, and what's Acts 1:8? You're going to go into all of Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. Well, right now, what I see happening is all the churches, these people who are waving the banner of Jesus are all huddled in this one spot, our Jerusalem, which is AltSpace. And now, because of it shutting down, all the churches are having to look for, what do we do next and where do we go? And what I'm hearing is a lot of them are going to different platforms. They're either looking at Rec Room, they're looking at VR Chat, they're looking at Big Screen, which is where we're going currently. they're looking at spatial.io, and they're just looking at all the different platforms that are out there for them to get into, knowing that 171 million people aren't all in alt space, but they're in
Spread
all
out.
different platforms of VR. I'm like, dude, this is potentially the VR version of our Pentecost of we're getting kicked out from behind our locked door in order to go out into the Judeas, Samaritans,
The
and the
big
ends of the
bad
earth
world.
in order to make Jesus famous.
That's right,
So
that's right.
I'm excited. So I'll close it there.
All right, VR Chap, what do you got to say?
So I just want to encourage that usually the darkest places is where the light shines the brightest. And so a lot of people are going to VR for their social connection because they couldn't find it in the physical world.
Yeah.
And so when you've got people that are in desperate need of social connection, in need of love, that sounds like the recipe for giving them God's love and giving them that community.
Real relationship.
Real
with the Lord,
relationship
yeah.
that goes beyond just talking about the latest anime. And so, and especially when people are going to these extreme pleasures, that means that they're in an extreme depravity. And so that being able to fill that place in their soul that they've been trying to fill with other things is an opportunity the church has for a community that's all just hurt inside the virtual, leaving the physical world for the virtual. Yeah. So, yeah, it's really exciting. I'm excited to see what more plants come into VR.
Yeah, good word, guys. So you can hit Stuart up at the Metaverse Church podcast, and if this has sparked your interest a little bit, he's got a lot of great content there. So go check that out, and we'll look forward to the future. We'll maybe see you in the VR world, and we'll say what's up. I'll fly over you in my helicopter.